I think we are on air. Hello and welcome to WAVE's webinar session. My name is Barbara Stelmachuk and I am a project coordinator at the WAVE office in Vienna. And facilitating with me today is Dr. Patricia Bell, who is our team leader in the WAVE office here. We would like to thank you for taking the time and joining us today, and we hope that the session today can be mutually beneficial and can support your work through knowledge sharing and reflection. As you can see from your screen, the session is titled Access Specialist Service Provision for Women Survivors of Violence, including for women survivors with children. And we are planning to run the session from 2 o'clock until 3:30. And depending on the time we spend answering any questions and listening to audience input, we may end sooner than 3:30. Okay, next PowerPoint. This one. Okay, so I would like to very quickly go through the webinar agenda. For those of us who are joining us, who have also joined the webinar before, this may already be familiar to you. I do want to run through just to let you know some technical aspects of the webinar. As you see, the agenda divides our session in different times. In a short while, I will do a small briefing about the webinar, tell you about the technical aspects and some general information about the goal and purpose of it, and also tell you about the method of the webinar. And then I'll go through some housekeeping rules about how to take part so that we can stay organized and that so all of us can get the most out of it. Then Patricia and I will introduce ourselves to you. And following this for about 30 minutes, we will introduce the topic of today's webinar session, which is mainly the standard of access. And we would like to divide the topic of access into 3 parts to provide you some general information related to the notion of access and also to address the topic from the perspective of access for undocumented women migrants and also access for differently abled women or women with disabilities. And after that, we will take any questions and comments from the audience. Now, if I go into the technical aspects, as you can see, as a participant joining the webinar, you are automatically muted, and we will keep the muting on for organizational purposes until the end of our presentation, and then we will unmute participants for beginning of questions and comments part of the webinar. Also, just so that you know, Patricia and I are not able to see you, even if your webcam is on, and I think you also cannot see us. If something doesn't work, if you're having any technical difficulties, you can just close out of the webinar and then log in again by clicking the link in your registration confirmation email. And also for your information, this webinar is being recorded. To give you a little bit of information about the webinar, this is a facilitated discussion. As I've already mentioned at the beginning, Patricia and I will present. After this, we will have input hopefully from the participants. The WAVE webinar is an activity within the WAVE Step Up campaign, which is running from 2016 through 2017. We are currently working on a handbook of European standards for women's support services. This is part of the Step Up campaign. And the goal of the webinar is to discuss the standard of access and the relevant topics that are related to the issue of access, and to answer any questions from participants, to hear your opinions or comments, suggestions, or any contributions you may have. And the results of the discussion will then be fed into the Handbook of Standards for Women's Support Services, which will be published at the end of 2016. As this webinar is part of the Step Up campaign, I would also like to call your attention to the WAVE Step Up campaign website. There is a screenshot of it on the screen right now that you should be able to see. And you should be able to see the address of the website as well. It is www.wave-stepup.org. And before I begin, I also want to just tell you how to take part in the webinar. It is relatively simple and hopefully enjoyable. So first have a listen to the presentation of the topics to prepare for the subsequent discussion. And during the presentation of the topics, if any questions arise, please write them to the facilitators in the questions pane that you have when you join the webinar. And we will be able to answer your questions at the end when the questions discussion part of the webinar starts. And during this part, during the questions and discussion part, I'm not going to be able to unmute everyone. So unfortunately, we cannot have a lively chat, but I can unmute individual participants. So if you will have a question or a comment, you have the ability to raise your electronic hand. And then we will invite your question or contribution to the discussion. And lastly, we hope that you enjoy. So, here are pictures of Patricia and of me. I will first introduce myself since I'm already speaking. I am a project coordinator at the WAVE office, and I'm responsible for different tasks here, including research, administrative data collection, and also I'm working now on organizing webinar sessions, which are part of our technological outreach and also part of the Step Up campaign. And I'm going to now let Patricia introduce herself as well.
Hello, I'm Patricia Bell. I'm team leader here at WAVE. I've been working here at WAVE since January. The main task that I'm involved in at the moment, apart from the WAVE campaign, is that I'm writing a handbook on standards, which we will refer to later in this presentation, and that handbook should be completed by the end of this year and will be then available on our website to be downloaded. I won't say anything more about that at the moment.
Okay, so I'll take over for a little bit just to give you a presentation about, or give you an introduction to how the presentation will go. We will again talk about access to specialist service provision. So we would like to talk about the meaning of the standard and provide some general information, but also talk about topics that are related to the standard, such as access to services, and how this relates to undocumented women migrants, as well as differently abled women who are survivors of violence. For each of the areas, we would like to discuss the relevant international legislation or documents, mainly the Istanbul Convention, and to see what the documents have to say about the topic. And in order to see how the issue of access is grounded in human rights instruments. We would then like to share some information about practical approaches to implementing the standard or inform you about the work that WAVE is doing on the European level in this area, including within the Step Up campaign and the upcoming WAVE annual conference, which, as you know, or as you may know, will be taking place in Berlin from the 19th through the 21st of October this year. And finally, because the topic is quite broad and there are many initiatives on the European level related to the issue of access, we would like to also share information about some of the initiatives out there in case these may be of interest for you, so that you can look further into some of these initiatives, especially if they can help you with your work. So when we discuss the initiatives, we will also provide a link to the relevant website so that you can access the information if you wish. So we will get started on the topic. Like I said, first I'd like to talk about some general information. In this part I will take over, but Patricia, if you want to jump in at any minute, if there's anything, please feel free to stop me and to say something. First, before doing this webinar, I just had a quick look at the meaning of access, and I saw that it basically means a way of being able to get something or to use something. And when we look at the Istanbul Convention, which for many of us is a very relevant instrument right now, if not the most relevant, there are lots and lots and lots of articles that refer either directly or indirectly to the issue of access. And I just want to go through some of them here. Article 13 is on awareness raising, and it talks about how the parties have to ensure wide dissemination among the general public of information on measures that are available. And the explanatory report further talks about what it means to disseminate information widely. And it says, it talks about dissemination of information, leaflets, posters, or online information materials on services. And this is basically contact information of local, regional, or national services, such as helplines or shelters and much more. So we see that accessibility is linked to information, because without information about services available, of course, women cannot reach those services. Article 23 is on shelters. It talks about having easily accessible shelters in sufficient numbers, and to reach out proactively to victims. So by reaching out proactively to victims, the Istanbul Convention again makes a link to information as an aspect of access. And of course, sufficient number of services is also related to access, as without sufficiently available services, access is limited. There are some other catchphrases that the Istanbul Convention mentions under Article 23. This includes ensuring immediate access, around-the-clock access, and also that it should be available in every region. It provides a standard of one family place per 10,000 head of population. This is in terms of shelter provision. And the part about being available in every region is very important, as it's important to keep in mind that women in rural areas, especially women in small isolated villages or women who are working or living on farms, may have limited access to service provision, as much of services have been established in larger cities. Some other articles that are related to access to services are Article 24 and Article 25. Article 24 is dealing with national women's helplines. And again, we get some phrases that are related to access, such as that the helpline has to be statewide, it has to be around the clock, meaning accessible 24/7, it has to be free of charge, and it mentions that one aspect of a national helpline is confidentiality or due regard to anonymity. And the explanatory report then further goes on to say that the helpline has to be available to everyone on the territory of the state and has to have multilingual support. So as in the next section we will talk about undocumented women migrants, we can already see that some of the aspects of running a national women helpline, such as confidentiality or multilingual support, are already of value to undocumented women migrants' access to services. One of the things I do want to also point out, and this may be a limit actually of the Istanbul Convention, is that it says it has to be accessible to everyone on the territory of the state. But very often we see situations where women are actually living outside of the country but want to call a helpline in a different country, but for different reasons they are not able to do that because the helpline number is not accessible from abroad, or they're not able to dial the number free of charge anymore if they're calling out of the country. So this is actually a limit of the Istanbul Convention, I would say. In relation to the helpline, again, it's saying that support has to be provided in relevant languages. It does say in some countries it is equally important to provide assistance in several languages to ease language barriers that some callers might face. And this, of course, depends on the country and how helplines do it. Some of them have funding available to provide multilingual support, some may not. Sometimes helplines use paid staff, or sometimes rely upon volunteers to provide multilingual support, or they sometimes join together with translation services in order to be able to provide multilingual support. Then if we go to Article 25, which is support for victims of sexual violence, it again says that the services have to be easily accessible and in sufficient numbers. But one of the very important points in the Istanbul Convention about this particular service is the statement that sexual violence, because it is a form of violence that is very traumatic in nature, it does require a particularly sensitive response by trained and specialized staff. So again, specialization and training and a sensitized approach is also an aspect of access, because if we're talking about access as being ability to use a service, or a service that can actually meet the needs of the survivors, training and specialization are very important, especially for victims of sexual violence. And lastly, the explanatory report provides a standard of one such center available per 200,000 inhabitants, and that it has to be geographically geographically available, or available in all regions. The convention, I want to point out, obligates the setting up of rape crisis centers or sexual violence referral centers, but not necessarily both. So now that I've gone through that, I do want to say a little bit about WAVE's publications, and that provides some information on how to implement the standard. One publication is Away from Violence, which is published in 2004. And actually one of the things that we are doing with the handbook is to update that publication. But it does talk about some practical aspects of running a women's shelter, and it says that direct access or around-the-clock support can sometimes be ensured when women residents volunteer or are volunteer the duty to answer telephone or to provide admission to women at night. It is of course always preferred that such work is done by staff. However, sometimes it may not be possible. So this is one way of ensuring 24/7 access. Another point that I wanted to mention is that admission should be provided directly by women's services. From our research, we do see that sometimes women have to go through centers of social work, which are not always open 24 hours a day, and this hinders admission for some women. And therefore, it's important that women's organizations are in charge of their own admissions. There's also a variety of ways that helplines organize 24/7 support, whether they have staff working from home at night, or they have access to answer the telephone or access to the database from home. Some helplines organize staff in 12-hour shifts, and in many cases, helplines or even shelters rely upon volunteers to ensure 24-hour service. In terms of offering floating support, this is a method that has been implemented in different countries, where it's not easy to set up structures in hard-to-reach places, so maybe in rural areas. And the idea here is that when women cannot come to a service, they can actually meet a professional at a coffee shop or at a restaurant in order to receive support that way. And we know from some of our members that there are other creative ways to conduct outreach. So, for example, I think this comes from Iceland. Women's NGOs organize a bus tour where they go to rural areas and set up information sessions or informational tables where they provide women with pamphlets and other documents where they can learn about different services available to them, as well as information about legislation in the country. So this is one way to do outreach for women. I do want to also bring your attention then to the WAVE conference, as I've mentioned before. It will take place from the 19th through the 21st of October, and on the 20th of October we will have sessions, workshop sessions, quite a few, and one of them will be, as you can see in the top corner of your screen, standards for specialist women's support services as required by the Istanbul Convention. And we will have...
If I could just interrupt, Barbara, I just wanted to say that's from 2 p.m. till 3:30 in the afternoon.
Okay. Yeah, so this will be an afternoon session, and it's we'll have some very interesting input. We'll be talking about the challenges that are facing services in implementing standards of the Istanbul Convention. We'll also see how in some countries certain things that are actually being done by the state, certain requirements imposed by the state are actually hindering the implementation of standards for specialist services. We'll talk about how some services have ensured quality services even with low funding or with no funding. We'll have a presentation on the logistics of running a 24/7 helpline. And then, as you will see, we also have insights from the Council of Europe about the Istanbul Convention and what it specifically requires from states and from services. So now, as I've gone through some of the general information, before I let Patricia do a session or discuss access for differently abled women, I will discuss the issue of access as it relates to undocumented women migrants. And what I wanted to mention here is, even though we are speaking specifically about group that we call undocumented women migrants, there is obviously, this is a terminology, but the issue of intersectionality is actually quite relevant here, as there is a lot more, obviously, than just the status of undocumented women migrants. So if, Patricia, you want to mention a little bit about intersectionality, maybe?
Oh, yes. Well, I think the main point just before we start really is just to mention that intersectionality really just draws attention to the fact that a particular identity, like, well, it's actually a temporary situation, being an undocumented migrant woman or a woman with disability, these don't have to be exclusive categories. It's not either or. So you can have women who have a variety of different permanent or less permanent situations that will interact with each other possibly. And it's also important to say that, you know, obviously not all undocumented migrant women are a homogenous group, and certainly not all women with disability are a homogenous group. And as we've already mentioned, you know, there are other groups that are referred to in the Istanbul Convention as hard to reach groups. For example, women living in rural areas. There is also women perhaps with mental health problems, maybe women with problems with substance abuse, and none of these categories is homogenous. Not all the women are the same, and they're not exclusive. So that you might be dealing with a woman with a very particular set of circumstances in her lives. And in fact, I mean, this will be very familiar to women's organisations. Ethnicity, culture and religion, particularly in Europe today, are not close or stable conditions, but it's rather a dynamic interaction. And when you're thinking about I mean, women's services are faced with this dilemma every day. When you're giving help to women who are approaching a service, those women will come with a particular set of conditions relating to their ethnicity, culture, religion, level of physical ability, whatever. And the woman providing help in the specialist support services will also have a particular set of circumstances around her identity, and that providing help is then always interactive. We can certainly go on to talk about this in the discussion if it's of interest. I think it's particularly interesting, particularly looking at women's shelters and issues around children. That's very often where cultural differences can become quite apparent in what is appropriate childcare. So, I mean, I think that, not only do you have a woman coming for support and advice and help who has a specific set of conditions which are unique to her, and you have the woman who's providing the support who will have a set of conditions that are unique to her. But you're also, I mean, particularly when we think about our network, we're dealing with countries that will have their own laws, they'll have their own political situation, there'll be different policies that exist, they will have their own history and their own economic conditions and economic structure, which all determines the possibilities that are available to women in that country. It's one of the most interesting things about working at WAVE is that there is such a great variety. So I just wanted to mention that because we always talk about specific categories. What can we do for women with disability? What can we do for migrant women or undocumented migrant women? But although we talk about it in terms of separate categories, of course this is experienced by all of us as individuals as interactive dynamic that's constantly developing. So that's all I wanted to say, Barbara. Back to you.
Thank you. Okay, so if I go into the Istanbul Convention and some other documents, there are also quite a few articles that bring up the issue of access for undocumented women migrants. The one that is very, very important, and I think is one of the nicest articles actually of the Istanbul Convention, is the one on fundamental rights, equality, and non-discrimination. One of the things that was mentioned in the explanatory report is that the drafters wished to add specific grounds for discrimination that were of great relevance to the subject matter, so to the subject of violence against women. And this is why they mentioned grounds for discrimination such as sex, gender, race, language, religion, but also one of the many, which is actually, the list is quite lengthy, but it also is mentioned that it's a non-exhaustive list. And one of the grounds that is often used for discrimination is migrant or refugee status. And of course, the convention prohibits that. So if I were to go into some other articles, I think they were mentioned in the previous section when I was talking about general issues related to access. But we have Article 22, which is on specialist services. It basically says that services should be available to all women victims of violence and that they have to be catered to their specific needs. And again, as we've discussed before, being able to access a service that is valuable to the service user is part of access. Therefore, services do have to cater to the specific needs of survivors. Another article which we've already discussed was Article 24 on the telephone helplines. And I think here I just want to stress the issue of confidentiality because this might be especially important to undocumented women migrants, as anonymity is not only important for gaining trust and for speaking freely, and to feel safe, to be able to speak to someone. But it's also for women who do not feel safe disclosing their irregular migration status, or who do not want this particular detail to be attached to any other identifying information, such as the name of the caller or the region from which they are calling. Therefore, the standard of anonymity for National Women's Helpline is very important in terms of access for undocumented women migrants. And then, of course, the helplines are required to provide multilingual support, as I have mentioned before. There's also, there are articles 59 through 61 that are of special relevance to undocumented women migrants. However, they're not, I wouldn't say they are directly linked to service provision, but they are worthy of mentioning as they cover issues such as migration and documentation, ensuring that a woman's residency status is independent of that of an abusive partner, and also that procedures are set to ensure enabling of gender-based asylum claims. And the Article 61 covers the principle of non-refoulement to make sure that women who are in danger in the country of origin are not returned to that country. So again, like I said, it's not specific to services, but it's also something to keep in mind. As staff should, of course, be engaged in familiarizing themselves with the existing laws and procedures and support systems in the country that may be able to support undocumented migrant women, whether to regain documented status or to prevent them from becoming undocumented in the future. And specialist organizations should ensure that the women also have a future in any given country despite of their undocumented status. Another document that I wanted to mention, which is actually already from 2014, but it does show that there is, at least on the European Union level, there is some movement in the area of protecting the rights of undocumented women migrants. In February of 2014, at the plenary session of the European Parliament, it was voted, a resolution was voted on undocumented women migrants. The motion for the resolution actually came from a report by the Committee on Women's Rights and Gender Equality, also known as the FEM Committee, and it called on national and European authorities to ensure that a woman's migration status does not prevent her from accessing decent housing, healthcare, and education, and also to safeguard access to justice for those who are experiencing violence and exploitation. The report mentioned that often across Europe, if an undocumented woman migrant reports violence, instead of receiving support and protection that she needs, often her undocumented status comes into focus or becomes of greater concern than the human rights violation against her. So what the resolution recommends is that member states of the EU actually delink the issue of violence from status so that women feel safe reporting violence to the police. And also it calls on ensuring protection for women from violence so that women are not turned away when they want to access shelter services, especially state shelters, so that they do not have to provide documents in order to access protection. And we also know that the Victims Directive, which is now in force since 2012, it's a European Union level legislation, also mentions something in this regard. And I think, Patricia, you wanted to mention something on that from the Victims Directive?
Yes, well, just to say that the European Victims Directive has been in force since 2012, and it doesn't say a great deal about intersectionality, but it does, in paragraph 66 of the preamble, emphasize the importance of not being discriminatory, and mentions in particular the equality of women and men, of children, the elderly, and people with disabilities. But it doesn't actually specifically mention migrant or undocumented migrants.
Okay. So that was about the international instruments out there that address the issue of undocumented women migrants who are victims of violence. And now I want to tell you a little bit about the upcoming WAVE handbook on standards for specialist services, because we do have an essay in this handbook, which again I said will be published at the end of 2016. The title of the essay is Intersectionality, Inclusiveness, and Non-Discrimination. And it discusses how what services must look like to be as inclusive as possible and non-discriminatory. One of the things mentioned is that many services have responded by hiring staff with multilingual skills, employing staff which reflect the diversity within the state, and also having an understanding that services must constantly expand. So, for example, to hire staff that can communicate in sign language. And such an approach not only reflects inclusiveness and allows for new skills to grow within an organization, but it also allows for additional perspectives to be included in the daily operation, as well as for future strategizing for the organization. And the concept of intersectionality is important, and I know Patricia already has mentioned some of it. It's important to service provision as it constitutes a shift in perspective from from what I've described above, it's kind of a shift in perspective in a way where service providers acknowledge power dynamics and power differentials. Women who are survivors of violence may experience violence differently depending on their situation and background, such as their race, class, ethnicity, whether they have children or do not have children, and such characteristics are not independent of each other, but they are experienced together. And this may, of course, impact on their needs as victims of violence, and this has to be taken into consideration when providing support. And one of the things that we also mention in the handbook, even though it is not something that directly comes from WAVE, but it's a very interesting approach that I want to raise awareness about. It comes from Women's Aid in the United Kingdom. It's called Change That Lasts, and it's called Strengths-Based Needs-Led Approach. And this is especially useful as I think we cannot say that there's any standard response that can be given as a recipe for service providers on how to best support survivors. But having an approach which focuses on addressing specific needs as well as resources of individual women can be especially of value for supporting undocumented migrant women, as in some cases we know that women's shelters may actually shy away from taking in undocumented women migrants because they fear that they cannot provide them with a long-term perspective. Or sometimes women's shelters actually fear that they may be breaking the law if they take in undocumented women migrants. And of course we know that state funding doesn't always allow women's shelters to take in undocumented women migrants. So the model of strengths-based needs-led approach involves certain principles such as identifying what is working well for survivors and to help them build on it, allow women themselves to identify the resources they have, expand the opportunities and space for women's agency, and focusing on strengthening women's agency, which would be a long-term strategy to a life free from violence, and not just focusing on ending violence, which would be a short-term strategy. So even in a situation where women are undocumented and may have to remain so for upcoming months or years, they still have certain resources, whether it's networks or job skills or access to open education. And when this is properly identified, this could actually enable women to live an independent and violence-free life in the future. It is important to mention in this regard that services such as shelters that do provide services to undocumented women migrants would have to be funded more generously in order to ensure that support related to getting residency permits or translation, integration, among other services that might be needed, are well covered. So now I just quickly want to make you aware about the WAVE Step Up campaign activity in this area. As you can see on your screen, we have number 4 called Increase Access to Protection and Support. And we are focusing on 2 specific groups of women here, women with disabilities and undocumented women victims of violence. Patricia will discuss the women with disabilities shortly. We are currently in the process of identifying actions that we can take to support, to improve access for undocumented women migrants. At the end of September, WAVE will be meeting with a European-level organization called PICUM, which is Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants, and we will be discussing cooperation possibilities for the Step Up campaign, so just to make you aware of this. And also to make you aware of the, again, going back to the WAVE conference, which is coming up 19th through 21st of October. On the 20th, we have workshops. And this particular workshop is titled Access of Undocumented Migrant Women Victims of Violence to Justice and to Services. And as you can see, we have a variety of speakers, including from the organization that I just mentioned, PICUM, which is the Platform for International Cooperation on Undocumented Migrants. And last in this section, or on this topic, I want to bring your attention to a few initiatives in the area of improving access for undocumented women migrants, so that you could maybe go and have a look at these if these are of interest to you. And under each initiative, well, under the 2 initiatives where they are available online, I have provided a website address so you can have a look. One of the things I want to mention for PICUM is that it is an organization that deals with lobbying and advocacy to shift policy in favor of undocumented migrants' rights. But a lot of their work also focusing on improving rights of undocumented women migrants who are victims of violence. And in 2012, they published a report called Strategies to End Double Violence Against Undocumented Women, Protecting Rights and Ensuring Justice. And the report provides some theoretical as well as practical background information.
Are we offline? Carry on, Barbara.
Okay.
We have to assume people can hear us. Sorry about the interruption if you're listening. We've just been informed that our colleagues here in the office can't hear us. We'll carry on.
Okay. So the report provides some theoretical as well as practical information about supporting undocumented migrant women, including information how to inform women about their rights, also some methods of gathering evidence for policymaking in the area of issues facing undocumented migrant women, such as the use of testimonies, information about raising awareness, including for women's organizations to work with trade unions, as well as ensuring access to shelters, which in some cases may actually include collaboration with faith-based shelters and other services to ensure that undocumented women migrants are provided with safety and support. On the second part, I am mentioning service provision examples from Switzerland and Sweden. Back in 2013, WAVE organized a parallel event during a UN Commission on the Status of Women in New York, and the panel was titled Women's Right to Safety and Support, Ensuring Access of Undocumented Migrant Women to Services. And we had some very interesting input from Switzerland and from Sweden. In one of the initiatives, it's an organization called Life Without Violence in Switzerland. They talked about how it's important to provide online support to survivors so that women can ask questions in an anonymous way and receive personalized responses from professionals. And this allows them, of course, the possibility to delete traces of their online visit as well to ensure anonymity. And one of the things that was mentioned is that an anonymous setting can be particularly useful in reaching migrant women who might lack trust in authorities and institutions in a country and culture they are not yet familiar with. And one of the things that the colleagues from Switzerland talked about is that the platform was quite new and that they were trying to strengthen their online presence by having cooperation with translators to enable multilingual support. And our colleagues from Sweden, this was ROK's National Organization of Women's Shelters and Young Women's Shelters, mentioned that in one of the municipalities in Sweden, there is a specific shelter that was opened just for undocumented women migrants. And this was done after women's organizations lobbied politicians and addressed politicians that they thought were more open and also in a way more brave to address this topic. And following such an effort, a shelter for undocumented women migrants was opened. And this is in a way a good initiative because I think it's much, I think women who may be afraid of reaching out to other services, if they know the service is specifically targeted at them, may actually feel more comfortable doing that. Although this also does raise the question whether it is the right approach or not to open a shelter that is specific for just one group. Of course, we don't have the answer for that, but that's just something to think about. And then the last project that I want to mention, it's called Cultural Encounters and Interventions Against Violence. It's a European research project which has come to an end in September this year. And it looked at services for women who have experienced violence in England and Wales, Germany, Portugal, and Slovenia, with a particular focus on intercultural issues. The project looked at how the fundamental right to freedom from violence can be impacted by national legal cultures and institutional cultures, and how those affect the practices of intervention. This project we consider it to be very important as it looks at several countries in Europe. However, it can be definitely applicable to Europe as a whole. And it is, countries are becoming more and more diverse. And of course, we know that cultural belonging can define social exclusion and inclusion. So the project looked at how national frameworks that are defined by history, and in terms of history, it looked at the area of colonialism, democracy, migration, and diversity, and how that impacts the way support against violence is provided. The forms of violence that were addressed in the project were intimate partner violence, child abuse and neglect, and trafficking for sexual exploitation. And the website is listed here on the screen, so you can see. And the reports on individual countries involved in the project are also available online on this website. Okay, now I will pass it off to Patricia, who will talk about access for differently abled women.
Good, thank you for that, Barbara. I'll try and keep this quite brief. I do just want to mention to start off that when we're talking about differently abled women, we're not just talking about physical barriers to participation by some women, but also discrimination against particular groups. For example, older women, women perhaps with no children. In some countries, support, for example, for domestic violence, places in shelters are only offered to women with children or women with small children, but women without children or women with very many children are also in need of support. Then I did want to just also mention women with mental health problems and women with substance abuse and women who possibly have convictions for criminal offences, because very often these are groups that also have, there are barriers to their access to women's support services or specialist support services. So very briefly, just looking at the Istanbul Convention, we've already mentioned the European Victims Directive, but looking at the Istanbul Convention, Article 4 does list a whole range of groups who are equal, who have to be provided with equal access to services. And very much puts the responsibility for that on the service providers, so it is a matter of outreach and expanding services to accommodate women with different needs. And Article 22, which talks that services need to tailor their service provision to meet the needs, the specific needs of women. We talked a little bit earlier about intersectionality and the issues that are involved in doing that. And Barbara also mentioned the strengths-based, needs-led approach to counselling and supporting women, which would accommodate these variety of needs. Then another piece of legislation I just want to mention in this context is the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, Article 16, which states the right for freedom from exploitation, violence and abuse, and specifically mentions the need for a gender-based awareness and for policies that are focused on the needs of women and children amongst people with disabilities. So just very quickly to go on, in our WAVE report we did ask questions about services for women with disabilities, and in general there is room for improvement. Some countries were not able to provide any service at all. And what I think, well, some of those were very small countries, some were countries in Eastern Europe, but regrettably, even in Western European countries that have a very good service provision, only about half of the service provision could actually accommodate women with differently abled women. And one particular thing that came out about asking about questions for differently abled women, that the focus was very much on wheelchair access, and that sensory impaired women, that is for women hearing impaired, sight impaired, that was very often not really in awareness when talking about issues around disability. This was a very particularly important point because I'll give you the reference later on, but there has been a European study on access to specialised victim support services for women with disabilities who have experienced violence. They do have their report, is available in English, German and Icelandic on their website. We'll give you the website link at the end of this service. That was done by the, well, by a range of agencies, including the Boltzmann Institute here in Austria. And they, for example, found that women with disabilities experience more isolation, manipulation and control than other victims of gender-based violence, and very often are lacking knowledge and information about gender-based violence and where they can go for help. When they do have the information about where they can go for help, they're also very unsure whether this help is accessible to them. And just particularly the Boltzmann Institute, or this research project, sorry, this European research project, came up with a finding that in terms of sensory access, that would be access for women sight impaired or hearing impaired, only with 0 to 4% of services could even say that they were able to provide, for example, sign language videos or alternatives for deaf or sight impaired women. The reason why services for differently abled women is so important is that here I'm referencing a German study from 2012, which is one of the very few studies looking specifically at the incidence of violence and gender-based violence against women with disabilities. And as you will see from the statistics here, women with disability were in childhood experienced 2 to 3 times more psychological and sexual violence than the general population. And in adulthood, again, the incidence of psychological violence was twice as high as the general population. And in terms of physical violence, also more than twice the incidence. And actually looking at sexual violence, again, the incidence for women with disabilities was 3 times the incidence among the general population of women. And in all cases, actually, deaf, blind, and women with mental disorders were more at risk of experiencing violence than the general population. And as we've already seen, they're also they have the lowest access to support services. So this is really a very urgent need to attend to this. Then going straight on to our campaign, because it is very important, you will find on the Step Up campaign website a strategy paper. We're very, very keen to hear your feedback on this. Get in touch and let us know if it was useful. We're very keen to have some feedback. Get in touch and let us know if it wasn't useful. That's very helpful to us as well. And we've done a very short checklist that might be interesting for you to go through, as it just gives you some ideas about the kind of things that can be done and the kind of things that can be done relatively quickly. And without a huge input of resources. I think that's important to say that it is possible to improve services to women with differently abled women to do quite a lot in a short period of time if we just have the awareness. Then there is, of course, the need for more investment in order to make services fully accessible. So I think we need to do both, but don't be put off if you can't do everything straight away. Start, and it will really make an impact on the lives of women who are experiencing gender-based violence. At our conference, and this is in a different time slot, you'll be pleased to hear, this is the first thing in the morning, 9 o'clock. We have got a workshop with a colleague from Iceland who'll be telling us about her project that she's set up about to empower survivors with different abilities, and also from the SUSE project in Germany, which is specifically focused on the needs of women and girls with differently abled women and girls, and that talk will be presented in easy language, so that might be interesting to people who are thinking about how they could expand their service, maybe to just come along and listen to those two colleagues, and I'm hoping that we'll have plenty of time to discuss. And we've got a colleague facilitating from Iceland who is very experienced in providing inclusive services. So I think I'm drawing to an end. I've got a whole range of services of information here. The SNAP project, which is just closing now, very recent, 2016. There's the address, www.snap-eu.org. They have looked at a whole range of countries and different groups of women, including older women, women with disabilities, women with mental health problems, rural women, migrant women, Roma women. They've really cast the net wide to look at how the so-called hard-to-reach groups are served by existing provision. That the findings of their research will be online in English. Well, I was going to say by the end of this month, but certainly by the beginning of October. Then we've got the ACCESS project that I've already referred to. The Ludwig Boltz Institute in Austria did that research with Germany and Iceland and the UK. That was a research project that was completed in 2014, so that was very current information. And I've also got on here a report from the BMFSFJ, which is a German ministry, but the report is in English. This is the English report of the findings of a large-scale survey on the incidence of violence against women with disabilities. It was published in 2012. It only relates to Germany, but I think that the findings are really very enlightening. Yeah, we need more research on from other countries as well, but I think we can start with the data that is available there. And then two more things. One is the results of a study into differently abled women and domestic violence, which was done in England. It was completed in 2007, so it's a few years ago now, but it's very interesting, in-depth research on differently abled women who've experienced domestic violence. And then, just as an example, the German Hilfe telephone, which is the emergency support number for women who've experienced violence, have a look at their website, because they do provide sign language videos for deaf women and the possibility for counselling by social media, for example. So that's been, I've managed to get through that in just under 10 minutes. Thrown a lot of information at you, but this PowerPoint presentation will be made available after the webinar. So I'll just go back now to Barbara, who is going to be introducing the discussion.
Okay, so we are done now with the presentation of the topic, which I think is quite, it's a very broad topic, the topic of access, and I'm sure there's plenty of other things we could talk about. But we would like to, of course, begin any questions or discussions that we could have right now. First, I will have a look at the questions pane and see if there's anything written in there. I do see from one of the participants who's just mentioned that we had some connection problems. I did notice that throughout, that there was some cutting of voice on and off, so I apologize very much for that. I hope you still got the information, most of the information that was presented. And other than that, if you would like to, if there is anything that you would like to ask, or if there are any comments that you have, please raise your electronic hand in order to make us aware that you would like to say something. If you can't think of anything to say, maybe if we are having a discussion, feel free to write it in the little questions pane. You know, if you don't have any questions, we'd be happy to just hear about your opinion related to implementing the standard of access in your countries. Tell us about any challenges that you face in implementing such a standard, or maybe mention any opportunities that you see either in your country or in Europe in general for making services more accessible. If there are any good practices that you would like to share with us, please also let us know. We'll give you a couple of minutes, and then we'll see if anyone has anything that they would like to say. We welcome your input.
Well, I think looks like we've overwhelmed everybody with information. Was it too much information? That would be good to know. Did we attempt to do too much in one webinar? Should we have divided it into separate, shorter webinars? If there's any feedback on that, we're pleased to hear from you.
Possibly, but I do see a question.
Lovely.
Hold on. I don't know if this is the same one as was written down, but I do have that there was a question from Maria. So, hello.
Hello. Yeah.
Hi, Maria. Did you want to say something?
No, I want to say that it was really huge and information what you gave us. Yeah. I think it was interesting, but maybe next time we should make it a little bit shorter. Yeah, maybe this can be the reason. I'm not sure how many participants still are in, but maybe we lost someone because it was a long time to listen 1 hour. But I'm not sure. I don't know what the participants say and how many participants we have already in or still in.
Yeah, I mean, majority of them have stayed. We have lost a few, so perhaps it was a very large topic that perhaps in the future we could divide a little bit. So thank you very much for that input.
But I think it was really very interesting. Yeah, it was lots of information, and especially on these important topics on undocumented migrant women and also on women with disabilities. I think these are really very important to discuss. Maybe some of you or some of the participants has here experiences which they want to share with us. How is it in the praxis? How is it in reality, the situation in your organization?
Okay. All right. Yeah, well, maybe give a minute or so, and if not, then we can close the session. Thank you very much.
Okay. I don't think anyone who's still online is wishing to comment. So thank you very much for attending this webinar. I think one thing that we'll take with us is maybe not to try and pack in too much. Maybe next time we need to divide it into 2 webinars. That probably would be a good idea. Right, so thank you very much for attending this webinar, and goodbye from the Wave office.
Goodbye.